I've been going to this old cabin for as long as I can remember. I started when I was a young man, but now at 65, it's where I spend most of my days, trying to enjoy the peace and quiet of the woods. There's nothing fancy, just a simple place I fixed up over the years. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. It's all I need after a lifetime of noise and mess. This trip started off just like all the others. I brought in enough firewood, made sure the stove was working, and got settled in. The first couple of days were peaceful, but something felt off this time. The air felt different, maybe it was the weather. Dark clouds had been hanging low since I got here, and the wind had a bite to it that didn't seem right for this time of year. I told myself it was probably just me getting old, making things seem worse than they were. On the third day, I went for a walk to the stream nearby. It's not far, just a short walk through the woods. The sound of the water always helped me relax. But when I got closer, something wasn't right. The path I always took had changed. It was overgrown, like nobody had walked through in years. I felt uneasy but kept moving. I figured it was just the woods taking back what belonged to them. When I finally got to the stream, the water wasn't like it usually was. It was dirty, not clear like I remembered. I crouched down to touch it but pulled my hand back quickly. The water was freezing cold, way colder than it should be. I didn't hang around. Something about it didn't feel right, so I headed back to the cabin. That night, the wind picked up hard. The trees outside were creaking and groaning, making the whole cabin feel like it was alive. I sat by the fire, staring at the flames, but I couldn't shake the feeling I had since I went to the stream. As I sat there, I started hearing something outside. It wasn't the usual sound of animals or the wind. It was footsteps, slow and steady, crunching on the dead leaves. I tried to tell myself it was just some animal, but I knew it wasn't. The footsteps were too heavy, too planned. I grabbed the flashlight I always kept by the door and pointed it out the window. All I saw were trees swaying in the wind. Nothing moved on the ground, but I could still hear the footsteps. They were going around the cabin, getting closer each time. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. I wasn't a kid anymore. I knew better than to let fear take over. The footsteps stopped. Everything went quiet. I stood there, frozen, listening for any sound. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping, like something was dragging across the cabin's walls. It moved slowly, almost like it was feeling its way around. My skin prickled. I turned off the flashlight, thinking maybe if I stayed in the dark, whatever it was would leave me alone. But the scraping didn't stop, kept going closer and closer to the front door. I stood still, barely breathing, hoping it would pass by. But then, the sound stopped right outside the front door. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared at the door, waiting for something to happen. Then, out of nowhere, a single, loud knock echoed through the cabin. It wasn't a person knocking. It didn't feel like that. Whatever was out there, it knew I was inside. I stood there, waiting for it to knock again, but it didn't. Instead, the footsteps started again, moving away, getting quieter and quieter until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the first light came through the trees, I packed up what I could and left the cabin. I didn't even care about the rest of my stuff. I never went back, and I never figured out what was out there that night. But I know one thing for sure. It wasn't a person, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever heard. It was something else, something that didn't belong in those woods. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it. And even though I've tried to forget, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for me to come back. Sometimes late at night, when the wind picks up just right, I can almost hear it. Those same slow footsteps, getting closer, like they're searching for me again. I used to run with a group, It wasn't something I could just walk away from. The money kept me in, and there weren't many other options. We did all kinds of jobs, from break-ins to drug deals. But this one was different. One of our guys vanished. He was working a deal with some shady people and never came back. Word was he was hiding out in a cabin deep in the woods, trying to lay low from the cops, or maybe from us. Either way, the boss wanted him found. A few of us packed up and headed out to the forest. I didn't like it, walking into unknown territory like that, but I had to go. Backing out wasn't an option. The plan seemed simple: go in, find him, bring him back. But things never go as planned in this life, especially not in situations like this. We parked near the edge of the woods and started walking. The forest was nothing like the city. All you could hear was the wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional crunch of a twig under our feet. It was quiet, too quiet. Every step felt louder than it should, even though the ground was soft with fallen pine needles. We had to move carefully. The police had been searching the area, and if they spotted us, we were done. After about an hour, we finally spotted the cabin. It looked old and run down, like no one had lived there in years. The windows were broken, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. It didn't seem like anyone was inside, but we had a job to do, so we moved in closer, keeping low. The door creaked as it opened. Inside, it was even worse than it looked from the outside. Dust covered everything, and the floor creaked with every step. There were signs that someone had been staying there. Footprints, an empty can of food, but the place was empty now. We split up to search the whole cabin. I went to check the back while the others looked around the front. That's when I found something strange. In the back room, there was a pile of torn, dirty clothes, like someone had been living there but left in a hurry. Next to it was a map, hastily drawn, showing paths through the forest. At the bottom, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was the word police. Whoever had been there knew the cops were closing in. I stepped out of the room to call the others when I heard a noise outside. It was faint, just a rustling, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I signaled to the others and we slipped out of the cabin, trying to stay quiet. We crouched behind a fallen tree, listening. The noise came again, closer this time. Through the trees, we saw them, cops, moving in on the cabin. We had no choice but to run. We bolted through the woods, doing our best to stay hidden, but it was no use. The police were everywhere, cutting off every escape. My heart was racing, and my legs were burning, but I kept going. I knew if they caught us, it would be over. Somehow, I got separated from the others. I didn't know where they went, and I didn't have time to look. I just kept running deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker, and the light faded as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sounds of footsteps behind me got quieter, but I knew the cops were still out there, searching. Eventually, I stumbled across another cabin, smaller than the first and hidden behind a cluster of trees. It looked abandoned, but I didn't care. I needed to hide. I pushed the door open and slipped inside, crouching near the window to watch for any signs of the police. I don't know how long I stayed there, but it felt like hours. My mind raced, thinking of what would happen next. The gang wouldn't be happy if I didn't bring the guy back. But there was no way I was going back to that first cabin. The cops were all over it. Then I remembered the map. It didn't just show random paths, it marked a way out. The guy we were looking for must have planned to use it to escape, knowing both we and the cops would be closing in. I pulled the map from my pocket, tracing the route with my finger. It was risky, but it was my only chance. I waited until it was fully dark, then slipped out of the cabin. The forest was quiet, but I moved fast, following the path on the map. Every little sound made my heart race. Every shadow seemed to move. But after what felt like forever, I saw it, the road. It was just ahead, through a thick line of trees. I thought I was free, but then I heard a snap behind me, like a branch breaking. I froze. Slowly, I turned around, my heart thudding in my chest. Standing just beyond the tree line was a figure. I couldn't see the face in the darkness, but I knew it wasn't the cops. This wasn't some random person passing through the woods. The reality hit me hard. It was him, the guy we were looking for. He'd been watching me the whole time. Before I could react, he disappeared into the shadows, vanishing like smoke. And that's when I realized it wasn't just the police hunting us. He was hunting us too. I ran, but it didn't matter. The forest was endless, the trees thick, and I was alone. Every sound echoed, growing louder, until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The footsteps were back, closer, faster, and I knew, deep down, that I wasn't going to make it out. I glanced at the map one last time before crumpling it in my fist. The paths didn't matter now. There was no way out, not for me. I had been the prey all along. I rented a small cabin in the mountains for the weekend to get away. It was deep in the woods, far from anyone, and it was so quiet out there. Exactly what I needed. The weather report said it would rain most of the time, but I didn't care. I brought a few books, and the idea of sitting by the window while the rain fell on the roof sounded perfect. The drive up wasn't great, though. The road was narrow and twisted around steep hills. As I went higher, the rain got heavier. By the time I reached the cabin, it was pouring hard. I parked the car and ran inside as fast as I could. The cabin was simple, a small living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom. There was a fireplace, but I didn't feel like starting a fire yet. I unpacked and made myself a cup of coffee. The rain didn't stop. I looked out the window, watching the trees sway in the wind. Thick fog started creeping through the forest, covering everything until I could barely see a few feet past the porch. The place felt lonely, like it was cut off from everything else. As night came, the rain got heavier. It pounded against the roof so hard it was the only thing I could hear. The fog was still thick outside, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been building since I arrived. I kept telling myself it was just because I was alone in a new place. That had to be it. Eventually, I decided to go to bed, hoping sleep would calm me down. I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart racing for no reason. The rain had slowed, but the cabin felt strange. I sat still, listening. There was nothing. The wind had stopped, and it was dead quiet. I tried to go back to sleep, but something felt wrong, and I couldn't put my finger on it. Then I heard it, a sound just outside. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was soft, like someone walking slowly on the porch. At first, I thought I was just hearing things, but then it came again, slow, steady footsteps. My chest tightened, and my heart started pounding. I knew no one else was supposed to be out here. I stayed completely still, trying to tell myself it was probably just an animal or the wood creaking. But then I heard the front steps groan like someone was standing right outside the door. There was definitely something there. I sat up, my body tense, listening for any more sounds. The footsteps had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was just outside, waiting. I didn't move for a long time. I was too scared to even breathe. After what felt like forever, I forced myself out of bed and walked quietly to the window. The fog was still thick, and the rain had picked up again, lightly hitting the roof. I couldn't see anything past the porch. The rain made it hard to tell if anyone was there, but that didn't explain what I heard. I crawled back into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that nothing was out there. But I couldn't sleep. My eyes stayed wide open, listening for any sign of movement. Hours passed, and the rain got louder. I didn't hear the footsteps again, but I couldn't relax. When the sun finally started to rise, I got up and packed my stuff. There was no way I was spending another night there. As I loaded the car, I turned to look back at the cabin. The fog still hung low around the trees, and the ground was soaked. That's when I saw them. Footprints, deep and muddy, leading from the side of the cabin into the woods. They hadn't been there before. My stomach dropped. Those prints were fresh. I didn't stick around to find out where they went or who made them. I jumped in my car and drove as fast as I could down that narrow road, not looking back. But something about the prints stayed in my mind. They weren't just around the side of the cabin. They circled the whole place. Someone or something had been walking around the cabin all night, watching. As I drove, one thought kept creeping in, making my skin crawl. Whoever it was out there wasn't just walking around. They were waiting. My sister and I decided to take a trip to a cabin in the woods with my friend from the hostel. We just wanted a break from everything. A weekend to relax and get away from the stress. The cabin was far from town, surrounded by trees, and there was no phone service. It was exactly what we thought we needed. A quiet place with nothing to worry about. The first day was really nice. We walked through the forest, followed some trails, and even found a small stream nearby. The air felt fresh, and the only sounds were birds and the water moving. That night, we made a fire outside and sat around it, just enjoying the quiet. It was strange how silent it was out there. No cars, no people, just the wind sometimes making the trees move or maybe an animal passing by. We laughed about how alone we were out there, but honestly, it made me feel uneasy. The darkness out in the woods felt heavier, like it was pressing in. There was no light anywhere except for our small fire and the stars above. By the second night, things started to feel different. I didn't know why, but the air felt thick, like something was off. When we went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just animals moving around, but the sounds were too steady, too close. It sounded like footsteps on the ground, slowly moving around the cabin. Every time I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the sounds would start up again, only this time they were closer. I didn't want to scare anyone, so I stayed quiet, just listening. Then my friend from the hostel came into the room I was sharing with my sister. She looked worried. She didn't say anything but pointed toward the window. I knew right away she had heard it too. Someone or something was outside. We sat in the dark, listening to the footsteps going around the cabin. My heart was racing, and I tried to keep calm, but I couldn't. The footsteps would stop, then everything would go completely quiet. Just when I thought it was over, I heard something hit the side of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. Then another thud, and another. It sounded like someone was throwing things at the walls, but I couldn't figure out why. This went on for hours. Footsteps, then something hitting the walls, then silence. None of us looked outside. We didn't want to know what was out there. Finally, the noises stopped completely. The rest of the night was silent, but none of us could sleep. In the morning, we found big rocks all around the cabin, too big to be thrown by any animal. Whatever had been out there had left them. But that wasn't the worst part. We found footprints, human footprints, coming from the woods, circling the cabin again and again, then heading back into the trees. We packed up fast and left. The cabin wasn't relaxing anymore. The whole drive back was quiet, none of us saying much. No matter how far we drove or how bright the day was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us that night. Not something passing by, something waiting. When we got home, I felt a little better, like maybe it was all just in my head. But when I checked my phone, I saw a message from a number I didn't know. Attached to it was a photo. It was a picture of the three of us, taken through the cabin window while we sat by the fire on the first night. I don't know who took that picture, but whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where we were the whole time. and I have no idea what they wanted. I rented a cabin up north, deep in the woods. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend escape from the noise of city life. The cabin next to mine belonged to my neighbor, an army sergeant. I didn't know him well, just that he lived there with his wife, and they mostly kept to themselves. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The air was cool, and the wind rustled through the trees, making everything feel more isolated than I expected. The cabin was small but cozy. After unpacking, I decided to take a quick walk before it got too dark. As I walked along the narrow dirt path behind my cabin, I noticed how close their place was. It looked a lot like mine, but bigger, with a small garden that was neat and a few solar lights that glowed softly. Something about their cabin felt different. It wasn't just the size. It was the silence around it. No lights were on inside, and there were no signs of movement. The place felt empty. I tried not to think too much about it and continued my walk deeper into the woods. I spent some time exploring before heading back. The light was fading quickly, and I didn't want to get lost out there. As I got close to my cabin, I noticed something strange. A soft glow coming from their cabin now. I hadn't seen them arrive, and I didn't hear a car, but I wasn't really paying attention. The night passed without any problems, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw the sergeant standing in his yard, staring straight at me. His face was blank, and he didn't wave or acknowledge me, just stood there for a few minutes before turning and walking back inside. I figured he wasn't in the mood for conversation, so I went about my day. Later that evening, as the sun set, I heard strange noises coming from their cabin. It sounded like thuds and soft movements. I told myself it was nothing and tried to ignore it. But later, around midnight, something woke me up, a loud crash. I jumped up and looked outside. That's when I saw the sergeant standing on his porch, looking down at something. His wife wasn't with him. His fists were clenched, and there was a mess of broken wood near his feet. From my window, I couldn't see clearly, but I sensed something was wrong. I thought about going outside to check on them, but decided against it. I didn't know him well, and if he was in trouble, I wasn't sure how I could help. Still, the thought bothered me. The next morning, I didn't see either of them. Their car was still parked where it had been the day before, but the cabin felt deserted again. That uneasy feeling crept back. I went about my day, but as evening came, I saw something that confirmed my worst fears. From my porch, I noticed the sergeant's cabin door was open, swinging slowly in the wind. I had to find out what was happening. I walked over, my heart racing, and stood outside their door, listening. There were no sounds, no signs of life. I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The place was a mess. Furniture was overturned, and broken glass covered the floor, but there was no sign of either of them. Then I spotted something. A trail of dark stains leading from the living room toward the back door. I followed the trail outside, down the steps, and into the trees behind the cabin. It went deeper into the woods, fading as it went. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I felt exposed, like I wasn't supposed to be there, as if something was watching me. The trail led to a large, disturbed patch of dirt. It looked freshly dug, but there were no tools or shovels around. I stood there, staring at the ground, knowing what I was looking at but refusing to believe it. The realization hit me hard, sending chills down my spine. That night, I hurriedly packed my things and left early, driving away from the cabin without looking back. I never reported what I saw and didn't check the news later to see if anything came up. Part of me knew the truth but didn't want to be involved. Whatever had happened, it felt like it was over, but I could never shake the unease. Now, every time I pass that road, the memory rushes back. The woods, the cabin, and the chilling sense that something was still out there. something dark and buried deep beneath the ground, waiting for its moment. I can't help but feel that the forest holds its secrets close, ready to claim anyone who dares to uncover them. The thought lingers, a whisper in the back of my mind, reminding me that some things are better left alone. It was a cold October afternoon when I got to the old cabin. My uncle had left it to me after he died, and I thought it was finally time to check it out. The cabin, built in 1978, sat alone in the woods, surrounded by tall pine trees. The worn wooden walls creaked as I pushed the door open, and the musty smell of old wood hit me as I stepped inside. Once inside, I noticed how dark it was, even with the afternoon light. Dust floated in the few rays that came through the dirty windows. I looked around at the old furniture. A shaky table, a few mismatched chairs, and a faded couch. It felt like stepping back in time, like I was in a museum from the late 70s. After I explored for a bit, I decided to take a walk in the woods. I grabbed a flashlight, just in case, and stepped out into the chilly air. The trees seemed to loom over me, and I could hear leaves crunching beneath my feet. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I stopped several times, looking around, but there was nothing there, just the soft rustle of the wind through the branches. Eventually, I found a small clearing that felt peaceful, so I sat on a fallen log and closed my eyes for a moment to take in the quiet. Suddenly, I heard a snap behind me, like a twig breaking. My heart raced. I turned slowly, but saw nothing, just trees. I tried to brush it off as nerves and decided to head back. On my way back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were marks on the ground, deep scratches leading away from the cabin toward the woods. They were too big to be from any animal I knew. A chill ran down my spine, and I hurried back to the cabin, my mind racing. Once inside, I locked the door and sat at the table, trying to calm my nerves. I decided to light a small fire in the fireplace, hoping it would warm the room and help me feel safe. As I stared into the flames, I caught sight of something moving outside the window, a figure darting quickly between the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart pounded even harder. I wanted to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. The beam moved over the trees, revealing nothing but shadows. Then I heard it again, a loud crash, like something heavy hitting the cabin. I jumped up, my heart racing. I pointed the flashlight toward the noise, and the light landed on something near the door. I held my breath. It looked like a large animal, maybe a bear. I knew I had to stay calm and think, but I realized I couldn't just sit there and wait. I needed to make sure I was safe. Quietly, I moved to the back window to peek outside. My instincts screamed that I had to get out of the cabin. I quickly grabbed my bag, stuffing my essentials inside, and took a deep breath. Just as I reached for the door, I saw something move outside again. This time it was closer. My gut told me it wasn't a bear. It looked like a person, hunched over and moving carefully. Panic hit me, but I forced myself to stay quiet and calm. I knew I had to escape without being seen. I opened the back door slowly, making sure it didn't creak. Once outside, I moved quietly toward the tree line. My heart raced, but I had to keep going. I darted into the trees, staying low and using the darkness to hide. I pushed through the woods, branches scratching at my arms and face. I didn't stop until I reached the dirt road about a mile from the cabin. Out of breath and shaking, I looked back. The cabin loomed in the distance, and I could see nothing else. It was eerily quiet, not even a sound from the woods. I made my way to my car, feeling the tension in my body slowly ease as I drove away. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing, just the dark road stretching out behind me. As I drove away from that old cabin, I realized I had escaped something that day, something I still couldn't explain. The woods were too quiet, too still. I knew I would never return to that place. Some places are better left alone, and that cabin was one of them. But as I drove, a thought struck me. What if whatever I felt watching me had followed me? What if it was still out there, waiting for me to return? I glanced nervously at the trees lining the road, half expecting to see a shadow lurking just beyond the reach of my headlights. I pushed the gas pedal down, eager to put distance between myself and that old cabin, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. As I reached the end of the road, I couldn't shake the thought that the woods had a secret, a dark, twisted secret that I had stumbled upon. And even though I was far away now, I couldn't help but feel that the cabin would always be there, waiting in the shadows, ready to draw someone else in. I had just settled into the old cabin deep in the woods, ready for a weekend of peace and quiet. The sun was starting to go down, casting long shadows through the trees. I was excited to escape the noise of the city and enjoy nature, so I began making a fire outside to cook my dinner. As the fire crackled, I noticed something strange at the edge of the clearing. A big figure stood between the trees. It was too dark to see clearly, but it looked like a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weird stance. I shook my head, thinking it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in a cabin surrounded by thick woods. As night fell, I went inside, locking the door behind me. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire and the little comfort of my surroundings. Just as I began to relax, I heard a loud thump against the cabin wall, making my heart race. It sounded like something, or someone was outside. I grabbed a flashlight and peeked through the window. The figure was closer now, standing just outside the glow of my fire. I could see more clearly. He had a scruffy beard, messy hair, and a dirty flannel shirt. Panic surged through me as I realized this wasn't a neighbor or another camper. This man looked rough and dangerous. I quickly backed away from the window and locked it tight. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. Should I call for help? There was no cell service out here. I grabbed my phone, hoping to get a signal, but there was nothing. I was truly alone. The thumping continued, getting louder as he moved around the cabin. I could hear him mumbling to himself, but I couldn't make out the words. I wanted to believe he was just lost, but something deep inside told me otherwise. My heart thudded in my chest as I listened, frozen in fear. Suddenly, the noise stopped. I held my breath, waiting for what would come next. Minutes felt like hours. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against wood. He was trying to pry the door open. Adrenaline rushed through me, and I knew I had to act fast. I glanced around the cabin and spotted a heavy log that had been used as a doorstop. I grabbed it, ready to defend myself. If he got in, I had to be ready. The door rattled violently, and I could see the knob twisting. My heart raced as I heard his heavy breathing. The door creaked under the pressure, but it held strong. In that moment, I remembered the kitchen knife on the table. I had to make a choice. Would I wait and hope he gave up, or would I confront him if he broke in? Just then, the door splintered. I gripped the log tightly and moved to the side, ready to swing. The door swung open, and the man stepped inside, eyes wild and desperate. I swung the log with all my strength, hitting him hard across the shoulder. He stumbled back, caught off guard. Without wasting a second, I dashed past him, bolting out of the cabin and into the woods. I ran blindly through the trees, branches scratching at my arms and face. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I followed the rough path back to the road, pushing through the underbrush until I finally saw headlights in the distance. I ran until I reached my car, jumped inside, and locked the doors. I didn't look back as I drove away, my heart still pounding. I was shaken, but I was alive. As I drove away, I felt the weight of fear settle in my stomach. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. The thought sent chills down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that he might have followed me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next chance to strike. That night, I realized how dangerous it can be to be alone in the woods. As I got home, I told myself I would never return to that cabin. The woods might seem peaceful, but they hide terrible secrets. I could still hear his voice in my mind, the way he muttered softly to himself, full of anger and madness. It was a sound that would haunt me for a long time. Every time I close my eyes, I see that figure standing in the trees, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. The feeling of being watched never left me. I knew that even in the safety of my own home, he could still be out there, waiting. And somewhere in those woods, the old cabin stood silent, holding on to the darkness that had come so close to swallowing me whole. I had been walking deep in the woods for hours. I wasn't looking for anything special, just enjoying the quiet. There were no trails, no other people around, just the sound of leaves crunching under my feet and the occasional bird call. After a while, I came across an old farm, forgotten by everyone, it seemed. The fence was falling apart, the fields were overgrown, and at the edge of the clearing stood a small cabin, probably part of the farm from long ago. The cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in over 20 years. The wood was gray and rotting in spots, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. The windows were cracked, but the cabin still stood somehow. It was strange to find something like this so far away from any road or town. I was curious, so I walked toward it, thinking I'd check it out for a few minutes before heading back. As soon as I stepped inside, the air felt heavy. Everything got quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. The air smelled old and damp, like mold and rotten wood. There were a few pieces of furniture left behind. A chair tipped over on the floor, a table missing a leg, and an old bed frame with a nasty, moldy mattress on it. It seemed like whoever had lived there had left quickly. The walls were covered in old wallpaper, peeling and stained, but there were no signs of who had lived there or why they had left. I looked around for a bit, wondering why this place had been left behind. In one small room, I found a bunch of old farm tools scattered on the floor. Some were rusted and useless, but others still looked sharp. The more I looked, the more I felt uneasy. There was something off about this place. Maybe it was how far away it was from anything, or the fact that it seemed like no one had touched it in years. Either way, I knew it was time to go. When I stepped back outside, something caught my eye. There were paths leading from the cabin into the woods. They weren't trails for hiking. They were narrow and looked out of place. It was like someone had been walking these paths regularly. Recently, my stomach tightened. I hadn't seen anyone for miles, and these paths didn't look old like everything else around the cabin. I backed away from the cabin, ready to head back the way I came, when I heard something. It was faint at first, like small branches snapping. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer, but as I stood there, listening, the sound got closer. It wasn't random. Someone or something was walking on those paths. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I turned and headed for the trees, trying to keep my footsteps quiet. My heart was pounding. Every nerve in my body was on edge. The sounds behind me grew louder, and then I heard heavy footsteps, steady and deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal anymore. Whatever it was following me. I moved faster, trying not to run, hoping to get away without drawing attention. The woods were thick, making it hard to move quickly, but I pushed through, trying to put distance between me and whatever was behind me. The footsteps were close now, maybe 20 feet away, and they were getting closer. I could feel the fear rising inside me, and I knew I had to get out of there. I was nearly at a full sprint by the time I broke through the trees and back into a more familiar part of the woods. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started, but I didn't stop running. I kept going until I reached my car, completely out of breath, my heart still racing. Once I was inside the car, I glanced back toward the woods. There was no sign of anyone, no sound, no movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, following me. Those paths I saw, someone had been using them and they were fresh. It didn't make sense. That cabin hadn't been touched in years, but those paths were worn down as if people or something else had been walking them every day. As I sat in my car, trying to calm down, I saw something in the distance. At the edge of the trees where the woods met the clearing, there was a figure. It didn't move, didn't come closer. It just stood there, barely visible in the shadows of the trees. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was watching me. I drove away as fast as I could, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone out there. Something had seen me, followed me, and I had a gut feeling that if I ever went back, I wouldn't be as lucky next time. Whoever or whatever it was, they didn't want me there, and they were waiting for anyone else who might come looking. I had never been to Italy before, but when my uncle asked me to visit his cabin in the woods, I couldn't say no. He lived there with his stepsister, a woman I had only seen once at a family event. The cabin was deep in the forest, far away from any town. It felt cut off from the rest of the world, with nothing but thick trees all around and a narrow dirt road leading up to it. The first few days were quiet. We walked around the forest trails, made simple meals, and sat in the silence. My uncle and his stepsister seemed used to this kind of life. They didn't say much, but I could tell they were close. I tried to get used to the stillness, but something about how silent everything was made me feel uneasy. It was like the woods were hiding something. One evening, I wanted some time alone, so I went for a walk deeper into the woods. The sun was starting to go down, and long shadows stretched between the trees. As I walked, I realized how easy it would be to get lost. Every part of the forest looked the same, and the trail was fading in some spots. Still, I kept walking, thinking I could just follow the sunset back when I was ready. After about an hour, I noticed something weird. The air was suddenly much colder, and there weren't any animals or sounds. No birds, no bugs, nothing. It was like the whole forest had gone quiet. I stopped and looked around, but the more I looked, the more I felt like I didn't know where I was. The trail was completely gone. I tried to go back the way I came, but it didn't take long before I realized I was walking in circles. No matter which way I went, I kept ending up in the same spot. Panic started to creep in. My phone had no signal and I didn't have any map. The trees seemed to be getting closer, and the forest that had seemed peaceful before now felt like it was closing in on me. As the light began to fade, I spotted something in the distance. It looked like a small, rundown building, maybe an old shed. I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I could find help or shelter for the night. I made my way toward it, the ground soft under my feet. When I got closer, I saw the place was falling apart, like it hadn't been touched in years. I stepped up to the window and looked inside. It was empty except for a few broken pieces of furniture and some rusty tools. But what caught my eye were the scratches on the walls. Deep, jagged marks like something had clawed at the wood. I don't know what could have made those marks, but I didn't want to stay long enough to find out. I turned away from the building and started walking quickly back into the forest, not caring which direction I went as long as it took me away from there. By now, the sun had fully set, and it was pitch black. I couldn't see much ahead of me, but I just kept moving, my heart racing. Then I heard it. Footsteps. At first, they were faint, like they were far away. But the more I walked, the louder they got. Whoever was following me was getting closer. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, but the sound of those footsteps didn't stop. I didn't dare turn around. I picked up my pace, but no matter how fast I walked, the footsteps stayed right behind me. That's when I started running. Branches scratched at my arms and face as I pushed through the trees, but I didn't stop. The footsteps behind me matched my speed, getting louder with every step. I ran as fast as I could, barely able to see anything, until I saw the faint glow of the cabin lights ahead. I sprinted toward them, my legs burning, but I didn't look back. I burst through the door, gasping for air. My uncle and his stepsister looked at me with wide eyes. They didn't ask what happened, they didn't have to. The look on my face must have told them everything. I collapsed on the floor, still trying to catch my breath. That night I couldn't sleep. Every noise outside made my heart race. I kept thinking I could hear those footsteps again, just outside the cabin. When morning came, I packed my things and left. My uncle didn't try to stop me. He seemed to understand. I think he knew something about the forest that he hadn't told me. I never told anyone what happened that night. I don't even know what was following me. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it wasn't. But I still think about those footsteps, the way they kept getting closer, no matter how fast I ran. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. Because whatever it was, it didn't stop when I reached the cabin. It was waiting right outside. I still hear it sometimes, in my dreams. The soft crunch of footsteps on leaves, getting closer and closer, never stopping. It's out there somewhere, and I have a feeling it's still looking for me. I was kind of excited for the weekend trip to the cabin. My male boss, female boss, and her daughter invited me to come along. It wasn't like I could say no, even though spending time with them outside of work felt a bit weird. The cabin was way out in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods. They said it would be a relaxing weekend, just to take a break. When we got there, the place looked fine. It was a regular log cabin with a porch, surrounded by thick trees that felt like they were closing in on us. There were no other houses or cabins nearby. Once we unpacked, things seemed calm. The air was cool, and for a while, it felt like the peaceful getaway I needed. The first night was normal. We had dinner, hung out, and eventually went to bed. The cabin was quiet, almost too quiet, and the darkness outside felt different from what I was used to in the city. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, but there was something else, a sound I couldn't really place. It was soft, like a low, distant rumble, but I ignored it. By the second day, something didn't feel right. The woods around the cabin didn't feel as peaceful anymore. The air felt heavy, like there was something hanging over us. My female boss's daughter seemed uneasy too, but none of us said a word about it. We were probably all trying to tell ourselves that it was just the loneliness of the place messing with our heads. That night, it got worse. Couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that same low rumble, but now it was louder. I stared up at the ceiling, waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. It was steady now, like something was out there, walking through the woods. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, maybe a bear or something, but it didn't feel like that. Felt too steady, too planned. In the middle of the night, I heard something hit the side of the cabin. It was a loud thud. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was like someone was out there, testing the walls. My heart started pounding, and I couldn't move. I just lay there listening. Then another thud came, closer to my room. I wanted to get up and check, but I was frozen with fear. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting for the noise to stop. When it finally did, I thought maybe it was over, like I had imagined the whole thing. But then I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps on the porch, just outside the door. They stopped for a second, and then I heard the doorknob turn. I couldn't move. I waited, thinking the door would swing open, thinking someone was about to come in. But the door never opened. The knob turned back, and the footsteps slowly walked away. The next morning, I didn't mention what I heard. Neither did anyone else, but there was a weird tension in the air. We all felt it. My bosses suggested we leave early, cut the trip short, and I agreed without even thinking about it. As we packed up, I noticed something strange outside. There were big footprints in the dirt near the cabin, leading off into the woods. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, but way bigger than any normal person's. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. We left the cabin without a second glance. None of us ever talked about that trip again. But those nights stayed with me. The sounds, the footsteps, the door that didn't open. I still wonder who or what was out there watching us. But the worst part is, whatever it was, it knew we were there the whole time. And it didn't come inside because it didn't need to. It let us leave, but I keep thinking, maybe it was just waiting for us to come back. I had been living in the same cabin for almost 20 years. It wasn't much, just a small wooden place deep in the forest. I built it myself when I decided to leave the world behind. I didn't miss people, and I never saw anyone, which was exactly how I wanted it. The closest town was hours away, and even when hikers passed through, they stayed far from my cabin. I lived off the land. The forest gave me everything I needed: food, water, a roof over my head. I got used to the quiet. No cars, no people, just the wind in the trees and animals moving around. In all that time, nothing strange had ever happened. Until last winter. It started with footprints. I saw them one morning after a big snowfall. They weren't mine, and they didn't belong to any animal I knew of. They were human, large and deep, leading straight toward my cabin but stopping at the edge of the trees. I stood there, looking at them, and felt a cold chill run through me, even though it wasn't the snow that made me feel that way. Whoever made them had stood there for a long time, just watching the cabin. First, I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone got lost. Maybe they were just curious. But the footprints kept showing up. Every few days, I'd find new tracks in the snow, always stopping at the same spot, never coming closer, never going further, just standing there. I started to feel uneasy. I kept the fire going all night, something I never used to do. I kept my rifle close by, too. But no matter how much I stayed on guard, I never saw anyone. The tracks kept appearing, and it started getting into my head. Whoever was out there knew I was here, and they didn't want to show themselves. As the weeks went by, the snow melted, and for a while the footprints stopped. I thought maybe whoever it was had moved on. But then, little things started happening. It felt like someone was watching me every time I went out to chop wood. The birds would go quiet for no reason in the middle of the day. One night, I woke up to a soft sound outside, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. My heart was pounding, but when I looked outside, there was nothing. It wasn't until one evening that things really took a turn. I had been out checking my traps for most of the day. When I got back to the cabin, the door was wide open. I knew I hadn't left it that way. I always locked it, even though I never expected anyone to come by. Slowly, I stepped inside, gripping my rifle tight. Everything looked the same as when I left, but I could feel it. Someone had been there. The air in the cabin felt strange, like something had been moved even though I couldn't see what. On the table, there was a small pile of pine cones. They had been carefully stacked like some kind of weird offering. I didn't touch them. I just stood there, staring at the pile. Whoever had been watching me had finally come close. They had been inside my cabin. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept thinking about the tracks in the snow, the feeling of being watched, and now this. Someone was messing with me and I didn't know why. The fear I had been trying to push down was now impossible to ignore. This wasn't just some curious hiker. Whoever was out there had been planning this for a long time. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. I grabbed what I could, packed up, and left. I didn't even stop to eat. I didn't know who or what had been following me, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. That forest, the one I had called home for so many years, didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like I had been living in someone else's space the whole time, and they were just waiting for me to leave. Now I'm back in town, living in a small apartment. It's nothing like the cabin. It's cramped and noisy, but it feels safer. At least that's what I tell myself. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up and feel that same cold chill I felt in the forest. I can't help but wonder if whoever was watching me is still out there. And I know, deep down, that they haven't forgotten about me. They were patient for 20 years. What's a little more time to them? I was looking forward to a quiet weekend with my wife and grandparents at their old cabin in the woods. They'd invited us to stay, and after a hectic couple of weeks at work, it seemed like the perfect escape. The cabin was far away from the nearest town, deep in the forest, with no neighbors for miles. Just pure quiet, no distractions. We got there late Friday evening. The sun had just set, and the last bits of light were fading as I carried our bags inside. The cabin smelled of wood and earth, like it always did, reminding me of the many times I had stayed there as a kid. My wife unpacked while my grandparents got settled. They were older but still sharp, and I always enjoyed being around them. After a quick dinner, we sat by the fireplace, the flames crackling as the only sound. Around midnight, I was lying in bed with my wife beside me when I heard something. It was faint at first, like something tapping on the cabin's walls. I figured it was just the wind, but then it came again. This time it was more distinct, almost rhythmic, like it was deliberate. My wife didn't wake, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I lay still, listening, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The noise stopped, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about it, wondering what it was. It just didn't sit well with me. The next morning, my grandfather was already up, getting the stove going for breakfast. He didn't seem worried about the tapping I'd heard the night before. We spent the day hiking through the woods, retracing old trails I used to walk as a kid. But the woods felt different now. The trees seemed closer, the shadows darker, like they were closing in on us. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard not to feel on edge. Later that evening, as the sun set and we sat down for dinner, I thought I saw something outside the window. Quick movement, like something darting behind a tree. I told myself it was just an animal, but when I looked again, there was nothing. After dinner, we gathered back around the fireplace. The wind had picked up outside, howling through the trees. But it wasn't a normal wind. It felt strange, almost like it was pushing against the cabin. That's when I heard it again, the tapping. This time it was louder and seemed to be coming from the door. I stood up, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. I glanced at my wife, but she was staring blankly at the fire, not noticing anything. My grandparents were still talking, unaware of the sounds. I slowly walked toward the door, each step feeling heavier. The tapping continued, now joined by a faint scratching sound, like claws against the wood. I grabbed the door handle, pulling it open just enough to look outside. The porch was empty, But then I saw something on the ground, bare footprints in the fresh snow. They started at the edge of the porch and led into the woods. I didn't go outside. I shut the door quickly and locked it. My heart was racing. Who was out there? I felt like someone was watching us. That night, the tapping was louder than ever. I couldn't sleep, lying there in the dark, listening. Eventually, I got up and checked all the windows, making sure every lock was secure. When I looked outside, the footprints were back, only now they were closer, coming right up to the cabin. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, I grabbed my grandfather and showed him the tracks. He wasn't scared, but he was puzzled. He knew this place better than anyone. We followed the trail together, leaving my wife and grandmother behind in the cabin. The tracks led us deep into the woods, winding through the trees. After what felt like hours, we reached a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood a huge, decaying tree. Around it were more prints, barefoot like before. But now there was something else. Torn clothes, old and weathered, like they'd been there for years. It was like someone had been living out here, hiding in the woods. My grandfather didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the clothes, then back at me with a serious face. "This place, it's not what it used to be," he said, his voice low. He turned and headed back toward the cabin, but I stayed for a moment longer, staring at the clothes. I didn't know why, but I had the feeling someone was still out there, watching. We left the cabin early the next morning. I couldn't stay any longer. Between the strange noises, the tracks, and the feeling of being watched, I felt like we were no longer alone there. As we drove away, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following us through the trees. But there was nothing. I never went back to that cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in those woods was still there, waiting for the next person to wander too close. And those tracks, they never disappeared. The snow covered them, but they were always there, just below the surface, waiting to be seen again. The woods hadn't given up their secret. They didn't want us there, and I couldn't stop thinking about the clothes we found, torn and left behind like they belonged to someone who had been trapped out there for far too long. Maybe they were still out there in the trees, or maybe they had moved on, waiting for someone else to take their place. Either way, the woods had claimed us, just like they'd claimed the stories my grandfather had once told me. Stories about things that hide in the dark, things that wait patiently, knowing that someone will eventually come too close. I had been driving in the mountains for hours when the rain started. It wasn't a light sprinkle either. It was the kind of rain that made it impossible to see the road in front of me. The winding mountain roads didn't help. I'd seen a sign a few miles back for some cabin rentals, so I decided to pull over and wait for the storm to pass. I found the dirt road that led to the cabins and followed it. After what felt like forever, I reached a small wooden cabin hidden in the trees. It looked old but strong. The rain was coming down harder, and I didn't have a choice, so I grabbed my bag from the truck and hurried inside. The place was simple, just a bed, a table, and a wood stove. It was dry, and that was enough for me. I started a fire in the stove to warm the place up. The rain slammed against the windows, and the wind howled outside. I tried to relax, but something felt wrong. Maybe it was being so far from everyone else, or maybe it was just the storm messing with me. The rain was so loud, it was hard to hear anything else, and every small sound in the cabin made my heart race. I lay down on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the rain. After a while, I started to drift off, but just as I was about to sleep, I heard something outside. At first, it was faint, but when I listened closely, it sounded like footsteps. Not the soft tapping of the rain, but heavy, clear steps. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or something passing by. But then the footsteps got closer. They moved around the cabin slowly, like whoever it was circling the place. I stayed still, barely breathing, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped right by the front door. My heart was pounding in my chest. I waited, hoping it would pass. But then I heard the door handle rattle. It wasn't a light sound either. It was hard, like someone was trying to get in. I froze in the bed, listening as the door rattled again. Whoever was out there wasn't going away. I slowly got up and grabbed the only thing I had, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. My hands were shaking as I moved toward the door, unsure of what was waiting for me on the other side. The door rattled again, even harder this time, like they were getting angry. I stood there, poker in hand, ready for whatever was about to happen. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps moved away from the door, getting quieter as they blended into the sound of the rain. I didn't move. I just stood there, waiting, listening to the rain and wondering if the footsteps would come back. But they didn't. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the door with the poker in my hands, staring at it, waiting for whoever was out there to return. But they never did. When the rain finally stopped and the sun started to come up, I grabbed my stuff and left the cabin as fast as I could. I didn't even look back. As I drove away, my mind kept going back to those footsteps, how close they had come. Maybe it was just someone caught in the storm, looking for a place to stay. But the way they moved around the cabin, the way they tried to get in, it didn't feel like that. Felt like they knew I was in there. And I kept thinking that if the door hadn't been locked, they wouldn't have stopped. Even now, whenever I think about that night, I can't shake the feeling that whoever was out there isn't done. That they're still out there, waiting in those mountains, waiting for someone else to stop at that cabin. And next time, the door might not be locked. I had just finished a long shift at the station. It was one of those shifts that leave you worn out, but at least you feel a little relief when it's over. I was planning to head back to the city, but my wife had convinced me to go with her to a cabin deep in the woods for the weekend. She had been asking for weeks, so I figured it would be a good way to relax and get away from everything. I arrived late that night. The air was cold, biting even, and the road was long. The cabin was far off from anything, no neighbors for miles. I had to park my car at the end of a rough dirt road and walk the rest of the way in. It was one of those places where there's no cell phone service, and if something went wrong, you'd be completely alone. When I got inside, the smell of pine trees and smoke hit me right away. The only light in the cabin came from the fireplace, and the sound of the logs cracking was the only thing breaking the silence. My wife was already sitting on the couch, curled up with a blanket. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, like a perfect escape. The night went on, and I sat there watching the fire burn down to embers. It was quiet, but then I heard something, a rustling sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a soft shuffle, like someone walking through the leaves. I stood up and walked over to the door, checking outside. There was nothing, just dark trees and the night air. The noises didn't stop. They were faint, but they kept coming. Little movements just outside, just out of sight. It was enough to keep me on edge. After a while, I decided to go outside and see what was going on. The moon was up, but it wasn't very bright. I could just make out the trail through the trees leading into the forest. I stepped outside, careful not to make a sound. The forest was dead quiet. No wind, no animals, just a heavy silence. Then I heard it again, a rustling followed by a twig snapping. Someone was out there, close, and I wasn't alone. I froze, my heart beating hard. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound of footsteps was clear, slow and steady, not the frantic movements of an animal. Someone was walking toward the cabin. I turned and ran back inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking, but I grabbed the rifle from the corner of the room. It had been there from past trips, covered in dust. I checked it, loaded it, and sat down on the couch, staring out the window. Every noise outside made my heart race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The hours dragged on, and the sounds kept coming. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel them out there. Each noise made it worse. It felt like whoever it was waiting for me to make a move, watching every step I took. The silence between the noises was just as bad as the sounds themselves, like a warning that something bad was going to happen. Then, around 3 a.m., there was a loud bang on the back door. I jumped, my grip tightening on the rifle. The door shook with the force of the impact, like someone was trying to break it down. I didn't hesitate. I rushed to the door, crouched down behind it, and waited. I wanted to shout out, to make some noise, but all I could do was listen to the silence that followed. No response, just silence. I slowly opened the door, keeping the rifle ready. The wind had picked up, and the trees were swaying. The shadows in the forest looked darker now, as though something was hiding out there. But there was nothing I could see. No one was standing there. Still, I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew someone had been there. Someone was still out there. I closed the door quickly, locked it again, and checked all the windows. I had to leave. It wasn't safe anymore. I couldn't explain why, but I just knew I couldn't stay. I grabbed my keys, shoved the rifle in the car, and woke my wife. We didn't talk as I rushed her out of the cabin. The car bounced along the dirt road as I drove as fast as I could, not looking back. We didn't speak much as we drove back to the city, but the feeling of dread never left. It was like something was still with us, following us. We didn't talk about it, but we both knew we weren't alone in that cabin. Someone had been out there waiting, watching, and it wasn't finished. I could feel it. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear those footsteps in the woods. Slow, steady, like someone was waiting for me to make a mistake. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it knows where I am. It hasn't forgotten. It's still out there, and I don't think it's done with me yet. I retired from the job a few years ago, but I still kept in touch with a few guys, mostly just to stay in the loop and keep myself sharp. So when I got the call from one of them, I didn't think much of it. They needed help with a search out in the deep woods, far from the city. A dangerous criminal was hiding out in an old cabin deep in the forest, and they needed extra hands, people with experience. I wasn't excited about it, but something inside told me I had to go. Maybe it was the old feeling of excitement I used to get on the job, or maybe I just missed the quiet focus that came with these tasks. So, I grabbed my gear, pulled on my old boots, and drove out to the woods. The place was more out of the way than I thought it would be. The trees were thick, and the only path was barely there, almost covered by plants and dirt. All I could hear was the wind moving through the leaves and a few animals rustling around. The air smelled heavy, like wet earth and pine. The cabin was old, falling apart from what they told me. No one had lived there in years, and it was far off any trails. It seemed like the perfect place for someone who didn't want to be found. The trees were packed tight around it, almost like they were closing in the deeper I went. As I walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. I've been in enough situations to know when something doesn't feel right, and this definitely didn't feel right. After a few hours of walking, I finally saw the cabin. It was as run down as I'd expected. The roof looked like it was caving in, and the windows were filthy. But I saw signs of someone being there. Footprints led up to the door, and a little fire pit outside had been used recently. The guy had been here, maybe still was, I checked around the place, keeping my eyes open for any traps or signs of movement. But it was way too quiet. That kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Something felt wrong. My gut told me to leave, but I pushed it down. I had a job to do. I moved closer to the cabin. The door was slightly open, creaking as the wind pushed it back and forth. I stepped inside, and the old wooden floor creaked under my weight. The cabin was small, just one room. There wasn't much inside. An old bed, a few broken chairs. No one was in sight, but there was something else. A terrible smell, like something had been rotting. I knew that smell too well. In the corner of the room, I noticed a trapdoor. It was half open, leading down into what seemed like a basement. My heart was pounding. I never liked basements, especially not in places like this. But I couldn't turn back now. I pulled out my flashlight and aimed it down into the dark hole. There were stairs leading into the blackness below. I took a deep breath and started down, each step groaning under me. The smell got worse the farther down I went. At the bottom, it was pitch black, except for the beam of my flashlight. The room was small, damp, and full of old junk. But in the corner, crouched against the wall, was the fugitive. His eyes were wide like he was terrified, but he wasn't alone. Next to him were piles of clothing, children's clothing. They were dirty and covered in stains. The smell hit me even harder then, and it wasn't just the smell of something rotting. It was the smell of death, deep in this place. Before I could react, I heard a low growl from the far side of the room, out of the reach of my flashlight. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I turned the light in that direction, and that's when I saw it. There was a figure hunched over. It wasn't a person, at least not anymore. The thing wore ragged clothes that barely hung on its bones, and its skin was pulled tight over its skeleton. The fugitive wasn't hiding from us. He was hiding from something else. Something that had been in these woods long before we came looking. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, colder than anything I'd ever felt. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor behind me. I could still hear that growling from below. Whatever it was, I didn't want to face it. I ran through the woods, branches slapping my face, the air feeling colder with every step. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, gasping for breath, my mind spinning. I left the search behind me, left the cabin, left the fugitive, and left whatever was down there. I never spoke about what I saw that day. I didn't know how to explain it. There was no way to make sense of it. But I know one thing for sure: the woods keep secrets. Dark, terrifying secrets that are better left alone. There are things out there, things you don't want to find. I haven't gone back since, and I never will. But sometimes when I'm alone, I think about that growl, and I wonder if that thing is still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble into its home. I never really liked my sister-in-law or her friend much, but when they invited me to their old family cabin for the weekend, I didn't feel like I could say no. The cabin was way out in the woods, about an hour from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where you felt completely cut off from everything. They were excited to show me the cabin, like it was some kind of special getaway. But even before we got there, I wasn't feeling good about it. The cabin was older than I expected. It creaked with every step, and the windows shook whenever the wind blew. Inside, it was full of old, dusty furniture and fading pictures on the walls. Something about the place just felt wrong. Maybe it was the quiet or the fact that there was no cell signal and no outside noise. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt like being trapped. The trees around the cabin were so thick, it was like the forest was pressing in, making everything feel cramped. The first night seemed fine. We lit a fire, had dinner, and then settled down for the night. But as the hours passed, The feeling of being alone grew heavier. It wasn't just quiet anymore. Something felt off, like a weight on my chest that I couldn't shake. By the next day, things started to feel worse. It was small stuff at first. My sister-in-law's friend said she thought she heard footsteps outside during the night. I brushed it off, thinking it was just animals or the wind. But then things inside started to change. A chair was moved a little when I came back from a walk. The door to the back room, which we hadn't touched, was slightly open. I knew it had been closed. We checked the whole cabin, making sure no one had somehow come in. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone. The back room was filled with old furniture and blankets that smelled musty. It didn't give us any answers, just made the weird feeling worse. That feeling that we weren't alone. That night was even worse. Couldn't sleep at all. The floor creaked in the middle of the night, loud enough to wake me up. My heart started pounding as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. It kept going, slow and steady, like someone was walking around the cabin. I got out of bed, my whole body tight with fear, and walked into the hallway. Nothing. I checked the living room. Still nothing. But the sound started again, this time louder, coming from the back room. That door had been closed all day. We hadn't opened it since we checked earlier. I felt my chest tighten as I walked toward the back room. I didn't want to open the door, but I couldn't just ignore it. Something inside me knew it wasn't just the wind or the house making noise. When I reached the room, the door was wide open, way more than before. I stood there, staring into the room. Everything looked like it hadn't been touched, but the air felt different, colder, like something had passed through. I stepped back, closed the door, and went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, we all knew something was wrong. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it. The whole day felt slow, the air thick with tension. Every little sound made us jump, and no one wanted to talk about what was happening. As the sun started to set, I had this feeling we needed to get out of there. I didn't care if they thought I was overreacting. The cabin didn't feel safe anymore. Just as I was about to say we should leave, my sister-in-law's friend gasped. The door to the back room was open again. It wasn't just cracked open this time. It was swinging back and forth, like someone had just pushed it. That was the last straw. I didn't say a word. I grabbed my things and started packing. We all did. As we got into the car and drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. For a second, I thought I saw something move inside. A dark shape in front of the window, almost like a person. I told myself it was just the light or my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. We didn't talk on the drive back. No one wanted to look at each other. No one wanted to talk about what we'd just left behind. But as much as I was glad to leave that place, there was something that stuck with me. The feeling that whatever had been in that cabin wasn't staying there. I haven't been able to sleep right since. I keep waking up in the middle of the night, convinced that I hear footsteps in my house, just like in the cabin. And every now and then, I feel like there's something in the dark corners of my room, watching me, waiting for me to notice it. Whatever was in that cabin, I don't think we left it behind, followed us back. And now it's waiting for something I don't think I want to know. I've always loved the forests in Norway. The tall trees, the steep hills, and the quiet made me feel at peace. So when I found a small cabin to rent deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. It was October, and the air was getting colder. I was ready for the rain and long, dark nights. All I wanted was to be alone with my thoughts. The cabin was small, just one room with a wood stove, a bed, and a table. It was tucked away on the side of a hill, surrounded by nothing but trees. I had to park my car at the bottom of a rocky trail and walk the rest of the way with my stuff. The rain had already started when I got to the cabin. It wasn't pouring, but it was steady, and I figured it would keep going all night. The first couple of days were just what I wanted. I spent my time hiking through the woods, breathing in the fresh air, and listening to the sound of rain on the trees. At night, I would light a fire, sit back, and read, or just stare at the flames. It was so quiet outside. Only the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves kept me company. On the third night, the rain got heavier. It was pouring now, and the wind howled through the trees. The cabin felt even more cut off from the world. I stayed inside, warming myself by the fire, watching the rain hit the window. Around midnight, I heard a sound from outside. It wasn't the wind or the normal noises from the forest. It was sharp like a branch snapping. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the weather. Maybe a tree had fallen. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer. It was followed by a heavy thud and then a dragging sound, like something being pulled across the wet ground. I got up and looked out the window, but all I could see was darkness. The rain was pouring down so hard it felt like a wall of water, and the wind was so strong that it made the trees sway. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the rain was making the usual sounds seem off. But that dragging sound didn't stop. It was coming from the trail that led up to the cabin. Something was out there, moving slowly but getting closer. My heart started pounding. I moved to the door, unsure of what to do. The wind pressed against it, making the wood creak. I stood there, frozen, trying to decide if I should open it. That's when I heard another noise, this time inside the cabin. It was soft, like a light tap on the wooden floor. My stomach turned. I turned around, listening. The tapping was getting louder, coming from the back of the cabin, near the bed. I grabbed a small flashlight from the table and pointed it toward the dark corner of the room. The light flickered a bit, but it was enough to see the floor. There, in the far corner, was a wet trail. Muddy water stretched from the door across the room. I hadn't noticed it before, but that wasn't the worst part. The trail ended right at the foot of my bed. I froze, staring at it. The sound outside had stopped, but now the cabin felt too quiet, like something was waiting. I stepped back toward the door, not taking my eyes off the bed. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe an animal had gotten in, but how would it have made that dragging sound? Before I could figure it out, a loud crash came from the side of the cabin. It sounded like something heavy had slammed against the wall. My heart jumped, and without thinking, I grabbed the doorknob and yanked the door open. Cold, wet wind hit me hard, and the rain soaked me instantly, but I didn't care. I ran. I slipped and stumbled down the muddy trail, not stopping until I reached my car at the bottom of the hill. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there, shaking. I was drenched, my heart racing, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be far away from that cabin. When morning came, the rain had let up. I knew I had to go back to get my things, even though I didn't want to. As I hiked back up the trail, I kept looking around, expecting to see something, but everything was quiet again. The forest looked just as it had before. When I reached the cabin, it looked untouched. But when I stepped inside, I froze. The muddy trail on the floor was gone. The floor was dry, like nothing had ever been there. But I knew what I had seen. I hadn't imagined it. I packed up quickly, my eyes constantly darting around the room. I didn't want to spend another second there. As I left, I glanced back one last time. The cabin looked so normal, so harmless. But I knew better. I haven't gone back to those woods since. Sometimes, when I'm alone late at night, I still hear that dragging sound in my head, and I wonder, whatever it was that left that trail, did it ever really leave the cabin? Or is it still there, waiting for the next person to walk through the door? That thought keeps me awake some nights, and I don't think it will ever leave me. When I was 8, my dad took me to a cabin deep in the woods for a weekend. We'd gone on trips before, but this place felt off. The cabin was old, falling apart, and far from any sign of people. Dad said it was a good place to relax, but it felt more like a place people go and don't come back from. We got there late in the afternoon. The sun was setting, making long shadows across the trees. As soon as we walked inside, I felt how cold it was. Dad tried to start the old wood stove, but it took him a while to get it going. There was a small bedroom where we would sleep, and the only window looked out into the dark woods. Even during the day, it was hard to see through all the trees because they were packed so close together. That first night, I couldn't sleep much. Every little sound the cabin made kept me up. The wind outside was strong and rattled the window, making it sound like something or someone was moving just outside. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking something was out there, watching us. The next day, Dad wanted to walk around the woods. We walked for what felt like hours, the trees so tall that they blocked out most of the sunlight. I stayed close to Dad, but my legs were smaller and I started falling behind. Before I knew it, I couldn't see him anymore. Panic hit me, and I yelled, but my voice felt like it was swallowed up by the trees. I found Dad again a few minutes later, but the feeling of being alone in those woods stayed with me. Something about the place felt wrong, like the trees were closing in, trying to trap us there. When we got back to the cabin, it was already getting dark. I was glad to be back inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling from earlier. That night, the sounds outside were worse. It didn't sound like the wind anymore. It was heavier, like footsteps walking around the cabin. Dad must have heard it too because he got up and checked the doors and windows. I lay still, watching him from the bed, too scared to move. The noise kept going, soft but steady, like something was pacing outside. Then it stopped. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. Dad acted like nothing happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We spent the day around the cabin, chopping wood, getting water, and staying close. I didn't want to go back into the woods, and I could tell Dad didn't want to either. As the sun went down again, I hoped the sounds from last night wouldn't come back, but they did. This time, they were louder, like whatever it was had come closer to the cabin. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away, but it didn't. The footsteps got louder, and it felt like something was testing the cabin, walking in circles around it, over and over. Then, a loud bang hit the door. My heart jumped as I heard Dad get up. I stayed frozen in bed, too scared to move. Another bang came, louder this time, and then another, like something was trying to break down the door. I heard Dad moving quickly, grabbing something heavy, maybe a log or the axe from outside, and then nothing. Everything went completely quiet. We didn't move for what felt like hours. The cabin was dead silent, except for the occasional gust of wind outside. I was too scared to ask Dad what had happened. The silence felt heavier, like something was waiting just outside. By morning, Dad's face was pale. He was still watching the door, his eyes darting back and forth. We packed up and left without saying much. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The door had deep marks scratched into it, like something had clawed at it during the night. We never went back to that cabin. Dad didn't talk about it, and I never brought it up. But sometimes, when it's late at night, and I hear the house creak or the wind blowing outside, I remember that place. And I can't help but feel like something from those woods followed us back, still waiting outside, just beyond the door. The old cabin sat at the edge of a long abandoned farm, surrounded by thick trees and tangled weeds. I had come here to get away from the noise of the city, hoping for some peace and quiet, but the moment I got out of my car, A chill ran down my spine. It was late autumn in 1975, and the air was filled with the sharp smell of rotting leaves. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and walked toward the cabin, feeling uneasy. As I stepped inside, the floorboards creaked under my weight. Dust floated in the weak sunlight that came through the cracked windows. The place felt like a museum, filled with old furniture and faded photos of people I would never know. An unsettling feeling hung in the air, as if the walls were keeping secrets. I brushed it off and started to unpack, trying to convince myself that it was just an old building. That first night, I sat on the shaky porch, listening to the rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. As darkness fell, the sounds of the night became louder. A branch cracked nearby, and I turned to see nothing but shadows. I quickly went inside and locked the door, feeling silly for being scared. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling uneasy but eager to explore the land around me. I wandered into the field behind the cabin, where the tall grass swayed in the wind. As I walked deeper, I found an old barn, its doors hanging loosely on rusty hinges. Inside, the smell of mold and decay hit me hard. I stepped carefully, my foot crunching on broken boards. As I looked around, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the dirt leading deeper into the barn. They were too big to belong to an animal. A wave of fear washed over me. I turned to leave, but then heard a noise coming from behind some old hay bales. My heart raced as I crept closer, peeking around the corner. What I saw made my stomach drop. The figure was crouched down, going through a box. I couldn't see their face, but their clothes were dirty and ripped. Panic surged through me, and I slowly backed away, trying to stay quiet. I bolted back to the cabin, locking the door behind me and pulling the curtains shut. My mind raced with all the scary stories I had heard about people finding intruders in abandoned places. As the sun began to set, I heard noises outside. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel driveway. I froze, my breath quickening. My heart pounded in my ears. I peeked through the curtains, hoping to see nothing. The figure was back, moving slowly around the cabin, as if searching for something. I had to do something. I grabbed my keys, deciding to make a run for my car. If I could just reach it, I could drive away and never look back. I took a deep breath and opened the back door, ready to sprint. But before I could take a step, I caught a glimpse of the figure's face in the dim light. It was gaunt and wild, with eyes full of a strange mix of anger and desperation. They looked like someone who had been lost for a long time. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to run, but something else held me back. This person wasn't a monster. They were just a human caught in a terrible situation. I felt a strange connection to their loneliness, and for a brief moment, I wondered what had driven them to hide away in the barn. I quickly closed the door and grabbed my phone, dialing the police. I explained everything as best as I could, begging them to send help. My voice shook as I reported the stranger in the barn, describing the old farm and the cabin. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, the footsteps outside getting louder. Then, just as my fear reached its peak, I heard sirens in the distance. The figure panicked, stumbling away from the cabin. I watched from the window as police lights flashed, cutting through the darkness. They quickly spread out, calling for the person to come out. In the end, I learned that the figure was a man who had lost everything, seeking shelter in the abandoned barn. The police took him away, but I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. As the sun rose the next day, I packed my things and prepared to leave the old cabin behind. But before I drove away, I glanced back at the barn one last time. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw the man standing there, his gaunt face peering out from the shadows. He raised his hand, not in a wave but as if to say, "You can leave, but I am still here." My heart dropped, As I drove down the long dirt road away from the cabin, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind, something that would always remain on that old farm. The darkness of that place would follow me, and I knew I could never truly escape the loneliness that filled those empty walls. Even in the safety of my car, I couldn't help but feel that someone was watching me, waiting for me to come back. The three of us, my sister, my gym partner, and I, decided to get away from the city for a weekend and head to a cabin in the woods. We were looking for a break from our busy lives, a chance to relax, and maybe share some spooky stories. But we quickly realized our little trip would turn into something we never expected. The cabin was old and hidden deep in the woods, surrounded by tall trees. When we got there, it looked charming enough, but it felt strange, like the walls were hiding something. The air was thick with the smell of pine, and the sound of birds chirping was comforting. Yet, it felt too quiet, as if nature was holding its breath. After getting settled in, we decided to explore the area. We walked down a narrow path that led to a small lake, where the water was clear and calm. We spent some time skipping stones and joking around, but as the sun began to dip behind the trees, a chill crept in. It was time to head back to the cabin. That evening, we sat around a fire outside, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The darkness wrapped around us like a thick blanket, and the only light came from the flickering flames. My sister and my gym partner joked about some horror movie cliches, but I felt uneasy, like we were being watched. As night settled in, we went back to the cabin and locked the door behind us. The inside felt warm, but the atmosphere was heavy. I decided to take a quick shower, needing to wash off the day. The sound of the water echoed in the small space. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling noise outside. I paused, straining to listen over the sound of the water. It sounded like footsteps, crunching softly on the gravel. I quickly finished my shower and wrapped a towel around me. I stepped out into the dim light of the cabin, my heart racing. My sister and my gym partner were still sitting on the couch, unaware of the noise. I glanced out the window, but all I could see were the shadows of the trees. My stomach twisted with worry. I felt the urge to check the front door but decided against it, fearing I would look silly. Instead, I turned off the lights to see better outside. The darkness swallowed the cabin whole. I peered out into the night but saw nothing. Just when I thought it was nothing, I heard a loud bang from the front porch. My heart raced as I turned to my sister and my gym partner, who now looked worried. I suggested we should check it out, but they hesitated. Finally, we gathered our courage and slowly approached the front door. I grabbed a flashlight and clicked it on, lighting up the area outside. The light revealed nothing but empty space and trees. Feeling a mix of relief and anxiety, we stepped outside. Suddenly, I noticed something on the ground. A small wooden figure, carved but twisted. It looked like it had been placed there on purpose, a warning or maybe a trap. A chill ran down my spine. My sister picked it up and looked at it closely. As she did, I noticed movement in the trees. Just a flicker, but enough to make my heart race again. We looked at each other, realizing whatever had left that figure behind was still nearby. Panic rose in me. We decided to go back inside, locking the door tighter this time. We sat in silence, the shadows feeling heavier around us. I felt trapped, like we weren't alone, even though the cabin was supposed to be our safe place. I glanced at the wooden figure resting on the table, its presence almost mocking us. Hours passed, and sleep slipped away from me. The sounds outside changed. Whispers rustled through the trees, drawing closer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I wanted to run, but I knew we had to stay still. Eventually, dawn broke, casting a soft light through the cabin windows. The weight of the night began to lift, and we felt relief as the sunlight chased away the shadows. But when we stepped outside, the wooden figure was gone. It was as if it had never existed, leaving behind a chilling reminder of the night's events. We packed our things, eager to get back to the safety of home. The woods felt different in the morning light, beautiful yet menacing. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something out there. It wasn't just the figure that haunted me. It was the memory of the whispers and the flicker of movement I had seen. I couldn't help but think about what might be lurking in those woods, waiting for its next visitors. As we left, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us drive away. But there was nothing, only the dark outline of the woods. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized that some places should never be disturbed, and some things in the dark are best left alone. The weight of what we had experienced settled on us, each of us lost in our thoughts, haunted by the silence and the secrets that lurked in those woods. I always loved the quiet of my cabin in the woods. It was a small place, surrounded by tall trees and a pretty lake. After moving there, I felt the calm of nature, but I knew I needed to get ready for winter. With my supplies running low, I picked up my axe and headed into the woods to chop some firewood. The air was chilly, and the sun peeked through the branches, making shadows dance on the ground. I felt strong as I swung the axe against the thick logs. Each hit felt good, and I was happy to be outside, away from the noise of the city. After a while, I realized I had gone deeper into the forest than I meant to. I stopped to wipe the sweat from my brow when I heard a rustling sound behind me. I turned, expecting to see a deer or maybe a rabbit, but there was nothing there. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I went back to chopping wood, but the rustling returned, this time much closer. I paused again and listened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woods felt different, like they were alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. I finished my last cut and stacked the wood, but unease began to creep in. As I turned to head back, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, some kind of motion in the bushes. My heart started to race. I picked up my pace, but the rustling seemed to follow me, getting louder and more frantic. I glanced back and saw a dark shape darting between the trees. I couldn't see what it was, but I felt its eyes on me, and fear surged through me. My mind raced, urging me to run. I remembered the old stories about the woods, the ones about things hiding just out of sight. They weren't just stories. Something felt very wrong. My breath became louder as I tried to sprint, but the underbrush snagged at my legs. I stumbled, barely catching myself before I fell, and I could feel that presence behind me, getting closer. Finally, I burst into a clearing and spotted my cabin in the distance. I bolted toward it, adrenaline pushing me faster. As I reached the porch, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I leaned against the door, straining to hear any sounds outside. The rustling stopped, but the silence felt heavy and ominous. After a few minutes of heavy breathing, I forced myself to calm down. I looked out the window, expecting to see something lurking outside, but all I saw was the quiet forest. A mix of relief and fear washed over me as I realized how quickly panic can take hold. That night, I sat by the fireplace with the wood I had chopped, the flames flickering and casting long shadows on the walls. I knew I would have to return to the woods, but I would carry the axe with me as a reminder of what I felt. The forest had secrets, and while I loved its beauty, there were dark parts one was better off not knowing about. The next day, I ventured into town to share my experience. I learned that many locals had their own stories about the woods, things they had seen or felt. I realized I wasn't alone in my fear. My love for the cabin remained, but now I approached the woods with a mix of respect and dread. As I listened to their tales, I felt a chill creep up my spine. One man spoke about a hunter who had gone missing years ago, last seen walking into those very woods. He said that at night, you could hear his cries for help echoing through the trees, but no one ever found him. Another woman whispered about strange shadows that moved without any sound, lingering just beyond the tree line, always watching, never coming close. As I made my way back to the cabin, I felt the weight of the forest around me. The trees stood tall, their branches whispering in the wind, almost as if they were sharing secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I reached my cabin and locked the door tightly, but as I sat alone in the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting, watching. I glanced out the window and felt a chill race down my spine. There, at the edge of the woods, a dark figure stood still, half hidden behind the trees. It didn't move, just watched, its outline blurred by the shadows. My heart raced, and I felt the weight of every story I had heard. I turned away from the window, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I was not alone in my cabin. I tried to distract myself, but every creak of the wood, every whisper of the wind felt like a warning. I sat in the darkness, knowing that the forest held its secrets tight, and some things are best left undisturbed. I promised myself that I would stay away from those woods, but deep down, I knew that the woods were not done with me yet. I had been excited about the cabin for weeks. I found it on a rental site, out in the woods, far from everything. It seemed perfect for a quiet break. The pictures showed tall trees all around a small wooden cabin, with a little lake nearby and no other houses in sight. Felt like just what I needed. After booking it, the owner sent me detailed instructions on how to find the place and where the key would be. Everything seemed right. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was getting low, and shadows stretched through the trees. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. The air was cool and fresh, and it was so quiet. I could only hear the wind and the occasional bird. I found the key under a rock, just like I was told, and let myself in. Inside, it was cozy. Wooden furniture, a fireplace, and a few small decorations gave it a warm feel. I put my bag down and walked through the rooms. It felt almost too good to be true, like something out of a catalog. I unpacked a little and settled in for the night. That first night was fine. I made a quick dinner, read for a while by the fire, and went to bed. But the next morning, things started to feel a little strange. When I stepped outside, I noticed the cabin wasn't as well kept as I had first thought. One of the windows had a crack in it, and the wood on the outside looked older, almost like no one had taken care of it in a while. I ignored it at first, figuring I just hadn't paid close attention before. Later that day, I went for a walk in the woods. As I walked, I noticed another house nearby, hidden behind some trees. I hadn't seen it from the cabin. It looked abandoned, overgrown bushes, broken windows. I walked closer and saw an old for sale sign by the driveway. That confused me because the cabin listing didn't mention anything about another house being so close. When I got back to the cabin, a strange feeling came over me. Couldn't shake it. Something wasn't right. The more I thought about it, the more the little things began to feel off. I decided to search online for more information about the place. That's when I found an old news article. The cabin wasn't supposed to be rented out. The owners had lived there for years, but they had moved out for a while because of family issues. They weren't renting it at all. My stomach dropped. The person who rented the cabin to me wasn't the owner. Someone else had given me the key, pretending to own it. I had no idea who they were. My mind raced. Why had they done this? What was the point of letting me stay here? I started packing right away. I had to leave, But just as I was about to grab my keys, I heard something. Footsteps outside, crunching on the dirt and leaves. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was moving carefully around the cabin. I froze and listened. I couldn't see anyone from the window, but the sound was getting closer, circling the cabin. I grabbed my keys and ran for the door, but then the footsteps stopped. Silence. My heart was pounding, and I didn't know what to do. I locked the door, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. Whoever gave me access to this place knew I was here, and now they were outside. I turned off all the lights and sat still, hoping whoever was out there would leave. Hours passed. I sat there in the dark, waiting, but the footsteps never came back. At some point, I heard the faint sound of a car engine in the distance, starting up and then driving away. The quiet that followed was worse than hearing someone outside. Not knowing what they were planning scared me even more. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I grabbed my things and left without even locking the door. I just needed to get out. As I drove down the narrow dirt road, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud, leading away from the cabin. Whoever had been there, they had been watching me the whole time. When I got home, I contacted the real owners. I told them everything that happened. They seemed surprised but not shocked. Apparently, it had happened before. Someone had been using their cabin, pretending to rent it out to strangers watching them, and then disappearing without a trace. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I keep thinking about those footsteps. They had no reason to leave without doing something. Whoever they were, they didn't leave because they were done. They left because they knew I was scared. Maybe that's all they wanted. But I can't shake the feeling that they'll be back. Maybe not for me, but for someone else. Someone who rents that cabin, thinking they're getting a peaceful escape just like I did. I had been staying in the cabin for a few days, trying to get away from the noise of the city. It was a small, old place in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick trees. At night, it was quiet, except for the wind and the occasional creaking of the floors. On the third night, I heard something strange. At first, I thought it was just the house making its usual noises. Old places like this make weird sounds all the time. But then I started hearing something else. A soft shuffling sound, like someone slowly moving around. It was faint, but it kept me awake. The sound seemed to come from below, from the basement. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just animals or the wind pushing something around. The next day, I decided to check the basement. The door was locked, but the key was hanging on a hook nearby. I don't know why I hadn't thought of checking down there before, but I figured it was time. I unlocked the door, grabbed my flashlight, and headed down. The basement was small and unfinished, with just a few old boxes scattered around. It smelled musty, and the air felt damp. I shined the light around and didn't see anything strange at first. But then I noticed something odd in the far corner. The floor didn't look the same as the rest of the basement. It seemed like part of it had been dug up and then poorly covered with old boards. I felt uneasy but moved closer. I pulled the boards back and found a small, dark tunnel leading further underground. The air coming from it was cold, and it smelled like dirt and something rotting. My stomach turned, but I felt like I had to keep going. I crawled inside. The tunnel was narrow, barely big enough for me to squeeze through, but it kept going on and on. Just when I was about to turn around and leave, I found something even worse. A small room dug into the dirt. Inside, there were signs that someone had been living there. An old, stained mattress was lying on the floor, along with a few empty cans. There was even a flashlight newer than everything else in the room. Someone had been staying down here. I didn't know for how long, but the dust on everything told me they weren't here now. The walls of the room had strange scratches on them, as if someone had been marking time or trying to send a message. I saw a few tools scattered around, dirty and worn out. But what scared me most wasn't the room itself. It was the thought that whoever had been living down here might still be nearby. The air was too quiet, too still. I felt like someone was watching me. I backed out of the room quickly and started crawling back through the tunnel. That's when I saw them, footprints. Fresh ones. They weren't mine. And they weren't leading into the tunnel, they were heading out, toward the basement, toward the house. Panic surged through me. I crawled as fast as I could, heart racing. When I reached the basement, I scrambled to my feet and slammed the door shut behind me. I didn't wait to see if anyone was there. I packed up my stuff in a rush and left the cabin without looking back. I still don't know how long someone had been living under that house or what they were doing down there, but I can't shake the feeling that they had been watching me the whole time, waiting for the right moment. Maybe they were still watching as I hurried out of that place, slipping back into the tunnel just as I turned my back. And the worst part? Whoever it was, they're still out there. They didn't stay behind. They followed me out. Now, I don't sleep right. Every time I hear a creak in the floor or a rustle outside my window, I wonder if it's them, waiting to finish what they started. I rented the cabin for a quiet weekend, just to get away from everything. It looked perfect, far from town, surrounded by thick trees, and just big enough for me. The first day was calm. I went for a hike, read a little, and just relaxed. By night, I felt safe, locked up inside with only the sound of wind outside. The second day, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Tiny holes in the corners of the rooms, too small for vents or screws. But they didn't seem to lead anywhere. The cabin wasn't fancy, and it didn't have any big heating systems or anything like that. It felt off, so I started looking more closely. That's when I found the first camera. It was hidden behind a little hole in the wall of the living room, facing the couch. It was small, but I knew right away it was a camera. I started searching the rest of the cabin. In the bedroom, there was another one behind a painting. In the bathroom, I found one under the sink, aimed right at the shower. My stomach turned. I realized these cameras had been recording me since I got there. It wasn't just one or two. There were cameras in every room. I wanted to get out as fast as I could. I grabbed my keys and ran to the door. But when I went to open it, the door wouldn't move. I pulled harder, panic setting in, but it felt like someone had locked it from the outside. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. I ran to the windows, they were all sealed shut. No matter what I tried, I couldn't get out. Then I heard a soft click from above me. I looked up and saw a little red light blinking on the ceiling. It hadn't been blinking before. Someone was watching me at that exact moment. They knew I had found the cameras. They were controlling everything. I rushed to the kitchen, trying to find something, anything, to break a window or force open the door. Before I could grab anything, a loud buzzing sound echoed through the cabin. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped fast. It felt like the heat had been completely turned off. I was shivering in minutes. That's when it hit me, it wasn't just random. Someone was controlling the lights, the heat, everything. I tried to calm myself, but it wasn't easy. My heart was racing, my hands shaking. Every move I made felt like eyes were following me, watching every step. I thought of heading back to the bedroom to figure out my next move, but the second I walked in, the door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. A red light blinked in the corner, another camera, watching. They were doing this on purpose, playing some kind of sick game. Time passed slowly. I couldn't think straight anymore. My fear turned into complete exhaustion. I sat down on the bed, too tired to keep moving from room to room. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, heavy, right outside the cabin door. I knew then that I wasn't getting out. Whoever set up the cameras had planned all of this, every step. They had been watching me the whole time, controlling what I did, and now they were coming. I was stuck inside with no way to escape. As the footsteps got closer to the door, I realized something worse. Whoever was out there wasn't in a rush. They weren't breaking in or trying to catch me off guard. They had all the time in the world, and I was right where they wanted me. The door creaked open slowly, and all I could think was how easy it had been for them. I walked into this cabin, thinking it was safe. Now, they weren't just watching. They were here. When the group of hunters invited me to their cabin for the weekend, I thought it would be a nice way to get out of town. They always talked about their hunting trips, showing off their kills, and bragging about their skills. I wasn't much of a hunter, but I figured I'd tag along and see what it was like. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any main road, and I liked the idea of being disconnected for a bit. The first day felt normal. We spent most of it getting ready, checking our rifles, setting up traps, and looking around for any signs of animals. The cabin was old, made of thick wood logs, with deer antlers hanging over the doorway like trophies from past hunts. I noticed the other guys seemed comfortable, like they'd done this 100 times. I, on the other hand, felt out of place. I tried to fit in, but one guy, Eric, caught my eye. He was different from the rest. He was on edge, his eyes never stopping for long on anything, always darting around like he was nervous. At first, I thought he was just jumpy, maybe not used to having someone new around. But as the day went on, his behavior got weirder. He'd disappear for long stretches of time and come back with his clothes damp, sometimes with dirt on his hands. The others didn't seem to care or even notice, so I tried to ignore it too. That night, the wind slammed against the cabin, and I barely slept. Sometime after midnight, I heard the cabin door creak open. The other guys were fast asleep, snoring loudly in their sleeping bags, but when I looked over, Eric was gone. I sat up, the cold air hitting my face, and strained to listen. His footsteps were soft, but I could hear him moving outside, through the wind. I thought about getting up to check, but I stayed where I was. Wandering through the woods at night didn't seem like a good idea. The next day, we split up to hunt. I noticed Eric kept watching me, more than anyone else. He didn't seem interested in any animal tracks or the birds we saw overhead. His eyes were always on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later, when we regrouped, the others talked about how quiet the woods were, no animals in sight. Eric stayed silent. That evening, things got worse. I started hearing strange noises from the woods. Not animal noises, something heavier, like footsteps, but not quite right. I tried to bring it up, but they just shrugged it off. I couldn't help feeling like they knew more than they were letting on. It wasn't just Eric anymore. All of them seemed too calm, too sure of themselves, like they were in on something. After dinner, I needed some air, so I stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately. I only walked a few feet from the cabin when I noticed the ground. There were drag marks in the dirt, like something heavy had been pulled through. My stomach tightened. I followed the marks with my eyes, watching them disappear into the trees. It was too dark to see what was out there, and honestly, I didn't want to know. I headed back to the cabin, trying to stay calm. My mind was racing, but I couldn't show them I was nervous. I knew now that this wasn't about hunting deer or any other animal. The way they watched each other, the way they acted so casually, it was like they were waiting for something. I just didn't know what. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept a knife under my pillow, gripping it tightly as I lay there, listening. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the door creak open again. Eric was up. I could hear him moving around the cabin, messing with something in the corner. The floor creaked as he got closer to me. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, I heard him whisper something under his breath. It wasn't to anyone in particular, more like he was talking to himself, mumbling in a low voice. My skin crawled, and I felt a chill run through me. He hovered near me for what felt like hours before he finally stepped outside again. As soon as the sun came up, I knew I had to leave. Quietly, I packed my things while the others were still asleep. My hands were shaking as I shoved my gear into my bag. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was pounding in my chest. Just as I grabbed my backpack, I noticed something on the floor. Eric's jacket, tossed carelessly on a chair. I don't know what made me do it, but I went through his pockets. Deep inside, I found a pair of handcuffs and a blood-stained rag. My hands went cold. This wasn't hunting. It never was. I slipped out of the cabin, careful not to make a sound. The trail back to the road was long, and I knew I had to move fast. I didn't look back, even when I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I kept walking, faster and faster, my breath tight in my chest. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally slowed down. My phone barely had any signal, but I managed to call someone. I didn't tell them everything. I just wanted to get away from that place as far as possible. But as I reached the road and felt some relief, a thought hit me. I wasn't the first person they had invited to that cabin, and I probably wouldn't be the last. I came to the cabin for a weekend getaway, hoping to escape the noise of the city. The first night, it rained hard, but it was nothing out of the ordinary. The next day, though, the wind picked up, and by evening, a real storm rolled in. The power went out, and soon, my cell phone lost its signal. I thought nothing of it. It was just a storm. The rain hammered against the roof and walls, loud enough that it drowned out almost everything else. I lit some candles and settled in for a quiet night. The only sounds were the wind howling through the trees and the occasional branch snapping in the distance. Hours passed, and I started feeling uneasy. Something didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. Every now and then, over the roar of the storm, I thought I heard faint noises. Footsteps outside or the creak of something heavy moving. I brushed it off at first, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. But then, around midnight, I heard something closer. A shuffling noise, like someone trying to move quietly. My heart raced. I got up and grabbed a flashlight, shining it around the small cabin. Nothing. I looked out the windows, but the rain was falling so hard I couldn't see anything outside. The woods surrounding the cabin were pitch black. That's when I noticed the door. It was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it earlier. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, but I twisted it and locked it again. Something was wrong. I backed away from the door, every hair on my neck standing up. I wasn't imagining things anymore. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud from behind me, inside the cabin. I whipped around, shining the flashlight into the shadows. A figure stood there, soaked from the rain, clothes heavy and dripping onto the floor. My mind raced. How had they gotten in? I hadn't heard any glass break, and there was no sign of forced entry. For a moment, we just stared at each other. The person wasn't saying anything, just watching me. Their breathing deep and uneven. I could feel fear rising in my throat. This wasn't just someone lost in the storm. The look in their eyes told me they weren't here by accident. I took a step back, my mind spinning, trying to figure out what to do. The flashlight shook in my hand. I didn't know how long they had been in the cabin or what they wanted, but I knew one thing: they were dangerous. Earlier that week, I had seen news reports about a fugitive on the run, a violent criminal. The storm must have been the perfect cover for him to escape, and somehow he had found his way here. I needed to get out, but the storm had cut off any chance of calling for help. No signal, no power. I was alone with him, He stood between me and the only exit. The air felt thick as I moved slowly toward the kitchen, trying not to make any sudden moves. I needed something, anything, to defend myself. My hand brushed the counter and found a heavy frying pan. I gripped it tight, praying I wouldn't have to use it. The intruder took a step closer, his eyes locked on me. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. My only chance was to run. I bolted for the back door, throwing it open and plunging into the storm. The rain hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran blindly into the woods, branches slashing at my face, the wind almost knocking me off my feet. Behind me, I could hear him crashing through the brush, following me. I ran until my legs burned, until I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore. I had no idea where I was, but I didn't care. I just had to keep moving, keep putting distance between us. Hours later, as the storm began to die down, I stumbled upon a dirt road. My legs felt like they would give out, but I forced myself to keep walking until I saw headlights in the distance. Passing truck. I waved them down, breathless, soaked to the bone, and shaking. I never went back to that cabin. The next day, they found him, dead from exposure a few miles away. The storm had claimed him, but the knowledge that he had been in there with me, waiting for who knows how long, still haunts me. Even now, sometimes when it storms, I can feel that fear creeping back in. I wonder if he watched me, if he was planning something worse than just hiding out. I can't help but think that maybe he didn't die out there. Maybe he found a way to survive, and that maybe, just maybe, he's still watching, waiting for another storm to come back for me. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods for a weekend escape, wanting to get away from the craziness of daily life. The cabin was warm and inviting, surrounded by tall trees that swayed in the breeze. At first, everything felt calm and peaceful, but it didn't take long for strange things to start happening. On my first night there, I noticed my backpack had been moved from the kitchen table to the floor. I thought I must have knocked it over when I unpacked. But the next morning, I found my favorite mug in the bathroom sink, even though I hadn't used it there. A knot formed in my stomach, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. As the days passed, little things kept going wrong. I tossed my snack wrappers in the trash can, only to find them neatly piled on the counter later. My shoes, which I always left by the door, would sometimes be at the edge of the living room, as if someone had been wandering around while I slept. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside me, but it became harder and harder to push away. One evening, I decided to take a walk around the cabin, hoping some fresh air would help clear my mind. The sun was setting, casting long shadows between the trees. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned around, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. Just trees, the fading light, and a creeping sense of fear. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, trying to convince myself I was safe. I fell asleep with the weak glow of my flashlight beside me. Suddenly, I woke to a soft creaking noise. My heart raced as I listened carefully. The sound came from the front door. I held my breath, my eyes wide open, straining to hear. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the creaking returned, followed by the sound of something being dragged across the floor. I lay there frozen, fear coursing through me. The memories of the things that had been moved rushed back. Someone had been in the cabin while I was sleeping. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight and switched it on. The beam cut through the dark, lighting up the room. Everything looked normal, but my gut told me otherwise. I crept to the door, trying to be as quiet as possible. I peeked through the window, but the darkness outside was thick and impossible to see through. Just as I was about to step back, I saw a shadow move just beyond the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see clearly, but I felt it. Something was out there, watching me from the woods. In a rush of adrenaline, I knew I had to get out of there. I quickly packed my bags, my hands trembling as I worked. I kept the flashlight aimed outside as I hurried to the door. Just then, I caught a glimpse of a small figure slipping behind a tree. My heart raced as I fumbled with the locks, finally bursting out of the cabin and into the cold night. I ran toward my car, fear pushing me forward. I glanced back one last time and saw a dark figure standing by the cabin, eyes fixed on me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and hit the gas, tires screeching against the gravel. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me the entire time. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure chasing after me down the road. A chill ran down my spine, and the hairs on my neck stood up. When I finally reached the main road, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I drove faster, my heart still racing, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. I never went back to that cabin, but the thought of it haunted me. I often wondered if someone was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance to sneak in and invade someone else's life. Even now, when I hear the sound of branches cracking in the night, I can't help but feel that presence close by, watching and waiting for the next unsuspecting person to enter those woods. The thought chills me to the bone. What if they are still there, just outside the light, hidden among the trees, always ready to make their move? For the past 2 years, I had been living alone in a small cabin deep in the woods. It was a quiet spot, far from town and surrounded by tall trees. I chose this life to escape the noise of the city and to connect with nature. I felt calm here, but I knew that being isolated came with risks. One evening, while I was chopping wood outside, I noticed something strange. The forest was too quiet. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind seemed to pause. I looked around but didn't see anything unusual. Just as I was about to ignore it, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It was fast and dark, almost like a shadow, but I couldn't figure out what it was. My heart started racing, but I forced myself to shake it off. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt uneasy. The silence in the cabin was heavy. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Eventually, I turned off the light and tried to sleep. Just as I was drifting off, a loud crash echoed outside. My heart leaped in my chest. I lay still, trying to hear anything over the pounding in my ears. I waited in the dark, frozen with fear. After a few minutes, I heard rustling sounds just outside my cabin. I wanted to peek through the window, but the thought of what I might see terrified me. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or some other animal. Then, a low growl broke the stillness. It was a sound unlike anything I had heard before. My blood ran cold. The growling got louder and closer. I could hear heavy footsteps now, slow and deliberate. Whatever it was big. I scrambled out of bed and grabbed the axe I kept by the door, holding it tightly. I stood in the dark, waiting for the creature to make its move. The growling stopped, and I could hear deep, ragged breathing just outside my cabin. I was terrified, sure that whatever was out there wanted to get in. Finally, the footsteps moved away from the cabin, and I heard something crashing through the underbrush. I took a deep breath and crept over to the window, careful not to make a sound. I peeked outside, heart pounding, hoping it was gone. What I saw sent chills down my spine. A large figure was moving between the trees. It was covered in dark fur, and its eyes glinted in the moonlight. It looked like a creature out of nightmares. A massive, wild beast that didn't belong in this world. I was frozen, watching as it sniffed the air and prowled around my cabin, searching for a way in. Minutes felt like hours as I held my breath, praying it would leave. But just when I thought it was finally gone, I heard a loud thud against the cabin wall. I jumped back, adrenaline rushing through me. I could hear it scratching at the wood, trying to get inside. Panic filled me. I had to do something. With my heart racing, I grabbed my flashlight and swung the door open, pointing the beam into the dark. The creature froze for a moment, caught in the light. I saw its massive form, and for a split second, I felt like I was staring into the eyes of death itself. It snarled, revealing sharp teeth, its breath hot and foul. Without thinking, I swung the axe at the ground to make a loud noise, hoping to scare it away. The beast let out a deafening roar and bolted back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there, shaking, unable to believe what had just happened. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept the lights on, listening for any signs of the creature returning. I spent the rest of the night planning. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin after what I had seen. The forest felt different now, more dangerous. I decided to leave at first light. As dawn broke, I packed my things and left the cabin behind. I walked fast, my senses on high alert, ready for anything. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the road. Looking back at the woods, I felt a mix of fear and relief. I had loved my time in the forest, but I realized some places hide dangers best left alone. I may have lost my cabin, but I had saved my life. As I walked away, I glanced back one last time, and that's when I saw it again. The dark figure watching from the tree-lean, its eyes glinting in the morning light. I shivered, knowing that I had escaped this time, but the woods still held secrets. Some part of me wondered if I would ever be truly safe again, knowing that whatever lurked out there might be waiting for me to return.